A mechanic's hands and a dead man's signature were all it took to stop a $100 million deal. And the woman who tried to crush him never saw it coming. The parking lot of Hargrove Automotive Group was the kind of place that made you feel your clothes were wrong. Reed Calloway noticed it the moment he pulled in, his '09 F-150 idling rough at the corner, while imported sedans gleamed in rows like they'd never been driven in the rain. He sat there for a moment with his daughter Piper in the passenger seat. Her small hand wrapped around a juice box, looking at the glass and steel building, like it was a place that belonged on a different planet. His knuckles were clean. He'd scrubbed them 3 times that morning with the orange pumice soap he kept by the garage sink. There was still a faint crescent of grease under his left thumbnail that he couldn't get out. "Let's go," he said. Piper was 8. She wore her school sneakers, the ones with the light-up soles, that she'd outgrown by half a size but refused to give up. She hopped out of the truck and took his hand without being asked. The lobby of Hargrove Automotive was all polished concrete and recessed lighting. A waterfall feature ran down one wall. Behind the reception desk sat a man in a fitted charcoal blazer whose posture said he had never changed his own oil in his life. "Good morning." The man's eyes swept Reed from boots to collar. "Do you have an appointment?" "To speak with Catherine Hargrove." Reed kept his voice even. "It's about the Meridian Motors acquisition." The receptionist's face didn't move, but something behind it recalculated. "Miss Hargrove is in a closed session this morning. I can schedule you for a callback next week. The acquisition closes today." Reed shifted the folder under his arm. "I have documentation she needs to see before that happens." "What kind of documentation?" "The legal kind." The receptionist picked up his phone. "I'm going to need to ask you to have a seat while I check with her assistant." Reed didn't sit. He stood near the desk with Piper beside him, her juice box making small sucking sounds in the quiet lobby. A few people in expensive clothes moved through the space without looking at them. A woman in heels glanced over once, clocked the work boots, and looked away. "Sir," the receptionist had finished his call. He was trying to keep his voice professional, but something had shifted in it. "Miss Hargrove's office has indicated they're not expecting anyone from outside the acquisition team today. If you'd like to leave your information..." "I'm not leaving my information. I need 5 minutes with Catherine Hargrove." "I'm afraid that's not possible." "It needs to be." There was a pause. The receptionist looked at Piper, then back at Reed. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you don't, I'll need to call security." Reed looked at his daughter. She was watching the waterfall, still holding her juice box. She hadn't looked scared yet. That was the thing he was most afraid of. Her looking scared. He thought about the last time she'd seen him in a situation like this. 2 years ago, when the county tax assessor's office had sent a deputy to the garage over a billing dispute that turned out to be their own error. Piper had been 6. She'd stood in the corner of the garage and watched a man in a uniform talk to her father in a clipped, dismissive way. And Reed had watched her face try to understand what it meant when adults treated your dad like that. She'd asked him that night if they were going to lose the garage. He'd told her no, and they hadn't, but the question had stayed with him like a stone in a boot. "All right," Reed said. "We're going." He put his hand on Piper's shoulder and steered her toward the door. 3 steps from the exit, he heard the elevator open behind him. He glanced back. Catherine Hargrove was shorter than the photos suggested. Late 40s, silver blonde hair cut sharply at the jaw, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Reed made in a month at the garage. She was talking to a man in a gray tie, something about wire transfer timelines. She moved like someone who expected rooms to reorganize themselves around her. "Miss Hargrove." Reed's voice crossed the lobby. It wasn't loud, but it landed. She stopped, turned. Her eyes found him the way a beam finds a target. Fast, precise, dismissive. "Who are you?" "My name is Reed Calloway. I need 2 minutes of your time." She looked at the receptionist. He shook his head slightly. "This gentleman doesn't have an appointment," the receptionist said. Catherine looked back at Reed, took in the work boots, the folder, the little girl with the juice box and the light-up sneakers. "I don't know you," she said. "I don't have time for this. You're about to acquire Meridian Motors for $92 million. Reed kept his voice flat. "Under the terms of the original partnership agreement your father signed in 2001, any full acquisition of Meridian requires approval from the secondary equity holder. That's me. Without my signature, this deal doesn't close." Silence. The man in the gray tie. Catherine's attorney, Reed would learn later, took a half step forward. Catherine didn't move, but something changed in her face. A small tightening. A recalculation that she covered almost instantly with ice. "That's a very specific claim," she said softly. "For someone who walked in off the street." "I didn't walk in off the street. I drove 40 minutes because I've been calling your legal department for 11 days and no one has called me back." She tilted her head. "Who do you say you are, exactly?" "My father was Dale Calloway. He was your father's original business partner in Meridian Motors. When your father bought him out in 2004, the buyout agreement included a provision. Dale's estate retained a silent equity stake and approval rights over any full acquisition in perpetuity contingent on certain conditions." Reed shifted the folder. "Those conditions were met 18 months ago when the company crossed a $100 million valuation. That triggered the provision. My father died last year. Control transferred to me." Catherine stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was a thin, professional thing that didn't touch her eyes at all. "Security," she said pleasantly, not looking away from Reed. "Please escort this gentleman out and call the police if he doesn't cooperate. Ms. Hargrove." Gray Tie took Reed's arm, not roughly, just with the quiet certainty of someone who'd done it before. Piper made a small sound and pressed against Reed's leg. He looked down at her. Her eyes were wide and watching, not crying yet, but reading the room the way kids did when they sensed something was wrong and didn't want to make it worse by asking. "Okay," Reed said quietly. "Okay, we're going." He let them walk him out. Piper stayed close, her free hand gripping the folder he'd let her carry because she'd asked to help. Outside, the morning air smelled like exhaust and fresh mulch from the landscaped median. Reed stood on the sidewalk with his daughter and the folder and nothing else, and watched the Hargrove building's glass doors close. Piper looked up at him. "Daddy, is it okay?" "Yeah." He crouched down to her level. "It's okay." Why wouldn't she listen? He searched for the right words. Sometimes people in charge of big things get scared of anything that might slow those things down. They think if they just keep moving fast enough, they won't have to stop. She thought about this. That sounds lonely. Reed almost smiled. "Come on, let's find somewhere to sit." They found a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Piper got hot chocolate. Reed got coffee he didn't drink and sat staring at his phone, trying to figure out what came next. He'd spent the last 11 days trying to do this the right way. Certified letters, phone calls, emails to 3 different Hargrove legal contacts he'd found through the state business registry. Nothing. No response, no acknowledgement, not even a form letter saying they'd received his communication. He'd hired a local attorney to review the partnership documents, a man named Gene Fulton, who worked out of a converted Victorian on the edge of town and mostly handled estate probate and property disputes. Gene had read the 2004 buyout agreement twice, made Reed explain how he'd found it, and then sat back in his chair and said quietly, "This is real. This provision is enforceable. And they've either missed it, which is sloppy, or they know about it and are hoping you won't notice in time. And if they close without my signature, then they're in breach. The acquisition is voidable. You'd have grounds for litigation, but it gets complicated and expensive. What if I get there before they close?" Gene had looked at him over his glasses. "Then you'd need someone better than me." Sitting in the coffee shop with Piper coloring on a paper placemat, the waitress had brought her. Reed called the number Gene had given him as a last resort. A woman answered on the second ring. Her name was Frances Odell. She was a corporate attorney out of Charlotte who had apparently made a career out of exactly this kind of situation. The kind where someone with a legitimate legal claim got run over by a machine that assumed they were too small to fight back. He told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "They just had you removed from the building." "Yes." "In front of your daughter." "Yes." "And the closing is today?" "This afternoon." "Gene thinks 2 o'clock. There was a brief pause. Then Frances said, "How fast can you get back there?" The second time Reed walked into Hargrove Automotive Group, he wasn't alone and he wasn't carrying just a folder. Frances Odell was 63, white-haired, and moved through the lobby like someone who had been there before and won. She had a briefcase, 2 associates carrying bankers' boxes, and a filed notice of legal standing from the Mecklenburg County Superior Court that had been prepared while Reed drove back with Piper asleep in the passenger seat. The same receptionist was at the desk. He recognized Reed and reached for the phone. Frances was already there. Business card on the desk before he dialed. Francis Odell and Associates. We're here to see Catherine Hargrove. Tell her it's regarding the Meridian acquisition. Tell her a temporary restraining order is being filed with the county clerk at 1:45 unless she speaks with us first. The receptionist stared at her. Francis waited. He made the call. This time, they were shown to a conference room. Reed sat across from Francis, Piper beside him, with the coloring book Francis's assistant had produced from somewhere with the efficiency of a stage magician. The little girl didn't ask questions. She just colored. Catherine Hargrove arrived 9 minutes later. She came in with 2 attorneys and a man in his 50s with the careful, practiced ease of someone who'd been managing problems for a long time. He introduced himself as Hargrove's head of corporate development, Dennis Price. He had silver hair and a handshake like a stone. "Miss Odell," Dennis said pleasantly. "It's been a while, Dennis." Francis's tone was cordial. "Still running interference for deals that need a second look? That's one way to put it." He sat down across from her and folded his hands. "You want to walk us through what you think you have? I'll let the document speak." Francis opened her briefcase. She slid a copy of the original 2004 Hargrove Calloway buyout agreement across the table, followed by the partnership provisions, followed by the transfer document from Dale Calloway's estate to his son Reed. "This is the silent equity agreement. Paragraph 7, Section 3. Secondary equity holder approval is required for any full acquisition of Meridian Motors, LLC. Reed Calloway is the current holder of that equity stake by right of inheritance." Dennis flipped to paragraph 7. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his jaw. Catherine was watching from the other end of the table. She hadn't sat down yet. "My father's legal team reviewed every outstanding agreement before this acquisition," she said. This provision wasn't flagged." Francis looked at her. "That may be, but it exists. It was never activated. It was activated 18 months ago." Francis produced another document. Meridian Motors crossed the $100 million valuation threshold on March 14th of last year. That's documented in their own annual filings. The provision activated automatically. Mr. Calloway's attorney sent notice to this office 7 weeks later. She slid a certified mail receipt across the table. Someone signed for it. The room was quiet. Catherine walked slowly to the end of the table and looked at the mail receipt. She turned it over, set it down. "Dennis," she said softly. The name sat in the air like something with teeth. Dennis didn't respond immediately. He was looking at a point on the table about 3 inches in front of the documents. "Were you aware of this provision?" Catherine asked him. Her voice was still professional, controlled, but it had gone very, very quiet. "I was told it had been resolved," Dennis said finally. "What does that mean?" "It means someone in the legal chain assessed it as non-actionable." "Based on what?" Dennis picked up his water glass, set it down without drinking, based on the belief that the estate would not have retained an attorney in time. Catherine stared at him. They were betting that he wouldn't find out, or that he wouldn't be able to afford to do anything about it if he did. That was the assessment, yes. Catherine turned to look at Reed. He was sitting at the other end of the table. The mechanic's hands, the work boots, the little girl with the coloring book, and she looked at him for the first time like he was a person she was actually seeing. "You drove up here yourself," she said. "With your daughter. I couldn't afford to leave her with anyone on short notice." His voice was level. "And I needed you to see the documents before you signed." Catherine held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to Dennis. "Get legal on the phone. Tell them the closing is postponed. Tell them why." Catherine, the buyer's attorney. "Tell them, Dennis." He left the room. Francis was already making notes in the margin of her copy. Catherine sat down heavily at the head of the table, and for the first time since Reed had seen her, she looked less like a person in charge of a machine and more like someone who had just discovered the machine had a flaw. "What do you want?" she asked Reed. Reed had thought about this. He'd thought about it driving up, thought about it in the coffee shop, thought about it watching Piper sleep in the passenger seat on the way back. "I want the acquisition to go through," he said. "Meridian is a good company. Your people will run it well. I don't want to block the deal." Catherine's expression shifted slightly. "Then why?" "Because the terms aren't right." Reed set his copy of the agreement on the table. "The buyout your team offered Meridian's founders last year was below market by about 15%. The founders took it because they didn't have the leverage to push back." Reed had reviewed the financials. He'd spent 3 weeks in the evenings after Piper went to bed, going through every document Jean had helped him locate. I'm not looking for a payout, but those founders built something. They deserve a fair price. Catherine looked at the agreement, looked at Reed. What are you asking for? Have your team run an independent valuation. A real one, from someone who isn't on retainer with Hargrove. If the number comes in above what was offered, you adjust. That's not how acquisitions work. I know how they work. Reed had spent 8 years as a senior engineer at a major automotive supplier, before a family crisis had brought him home to help his father, and he'd never gone back. I've been in those rooms. I know how they work when the other side has leverage and when they don't. The founders didn't have leverage. Now there's a question about whether this deal closes at all. That changes things. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have asked for money. From us. Your stake is worth." "I know what it's worth." "Then why? Because it's not about what I can get." Reed's voice was steady. "My father was Dale Calloway's son, and Dale spent 3 years building Meridian with your father before he got bought out. He told me about it once, before he got sick. Said the deal wasn't as clean as it looked, but he didn't have the documents to fight it back then." Reed paused. "I'm not trying to replay that. I just want the people who built the next thing to get what they're owed." The room was quiet, except for the soft sound of Piper's crayon against paper. Catherine looked at Frances. Frances gave nothing away, but Reed had gotten a sense of her in the past 2 hours. She appreciated it when someone knew what they wanted and said it plainly. "An independent valuation takes time," Catherine said. "I'll sign a 30-day extension." Reed had already discussed this with Frances. "If the number is within 5% of the original offer, I'll approve the acquisition on the original terms. If it's higher, you adjust and I sign. And if we refuse?" Frances smiled thinly. "Then we file the TRO, and you explain to the acquisition team why a provision nobody flagged is holding up a $92 million deal." Dennis came back into the room. His face was composed, but Reed could see the effort it was taking. "The buyer's attorney wants a call. They're not happy." "Let them not be happy," Catherine said. She looked at Reed. "I'll need to review the valuation terms with legal." "Of course." She stood, looked at Piper. The little girl was coloring a horse. She'd gotten the legs slightly wrong, but the mane was impressive. "She's good," Catherine said, almost to herself. "She's better at most things than I am," Reed said. Something crossed Catherine's face. Not quite a smile, but close. They went back and forth for 2 hours. Legal on the phone, Dennis hovering, Frances making small, precise notes. Reed sat through it and answered questions when he was asked and said nothing when he wasn't. Piper finished the horse, started a forest, fell asleep in her chair. At the end of the second hour, Catherine stood and extended her hand. 30 days, she said. Independent valuation, terms as stated. If the numbers are what you believe, I'll adjust. Reed shook her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were different from the lobby, still sharp, but something behind them had shifted. "I want to ask you something," Catherine said. She didn't drop his hand immediately. "Why bring her?" She glanced at Piper. "You must have known it would be hard." Reed looked at his daughter asleep in the conference room chair, crayon still loosely in her fist. "Because I didn't want to lie to her." He looked back at Catherine. "If something went sideways today, I needed her to know I'd shown up." That her dad tried. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she let go of his hand. Frances steered them out of the building with the brisk efficiency of someone who billed by the hour and had another call at 5. In the parking lot, Reed carried Piper to the truck without waking her. Frances stood by her car with her briefcase and looked at him over her glasses. "You did well in there," she said. "I just said what was true. That's rarer than you'd think." She drove away. Reed sat in the truck with his sleeping daughter, and the parking lot going quiet around him, and didn't start the engine for a while. The 30 days were not easy. Hargrove's legal team found 3 reasons a week to question the process. The independent valuator, a firm out of Raleigh that neither side had used before, took 4 days longer than expected. There were calls that Reed wasn't invited to, and decisions made in rooms he didn't have access to. Jean Fulton called him every few days with updates. Frances called less often, but said more when she did. At one point, Catherine's team made a quiet approach, not through Frances, just a message relayed through Dennis, suggesting that a cash settlement might simplify things for everyone. Reed said no. He said it the way he'd said everything else in this process, flatly, without anger, and without explaining himself more than once. The valuator came in at $108 million. The original offer had been $89 million. Catherine called him directly when she got the number. He was under a truck at the garage when his phone buzzed. He rolled out on the creeper, wiped his hands, and answered. "The valuation is 108, she said without preamble. "I know. Francis called me an hour ago." A brief pause. Then, "Are you going to gloat?" "No." "Are you going to adjust?" Another pause. Longer. "Yes. We're adjusting to 105. My board isn't comfortable at 108 given market conditions. My attorney will send the revised terms today." Reed was quiet for a moment, watching Piper through the open garage bay. She was sitting on an upturned bucket in the sun, doing homework. She'd started spending afternoons at the garage after school. He'd set up a fold-out table in the corner for her. "That's fair," he said. "You're not going to push for 108? I said I'd sign if the number was within 5%. 105 is close enough." "You gave ground," Catherine said. "You didn't have to." "I'm not trying to win," Reed said. "I'm trying to make sure the founders get a fair deal." There was a pause on the other end that felt like something being reconsidered. "The founders," Catherine said finally. "You've spoken to them?" "A few times." "What do they think about all this?" Reed thought about the call he'd had with the older of the two Meridian founders, a man named Walt, who'd built the company's first service bays by hand in his late 30s. Walt had been quiet when Reed first explained the situation. Then he'd said, "Nobody's ever come back for us before." "They're grateful," Reed said. "They're also a little in shock, I imagine." Catherine's voice was different on the phone. Less curated, less like someone managing a situation. "They built a good company. They did. I should have run a better process from the start." She said it plainly. No qualification. "My team cut corners on due diligence because we wanted to close fast. That's on me." Reed didn't say anything. I have a question," Catherine said. "And you can tell me it's none of my business." "All right. The provision your father found in that agreement, the secondary equity stake. Did you know it existed before he died?" "No." Reed looked at the garage ceiling. He found out from Jean Fulton 2 weeks after the funeral, going through Dale's papers. There had been a manila envelope in a filing cabinet with Reed's name on it in Dale's handwriting. Inside had been the 2004 buyout agreement, a copy of the equity provision, and a single note card that said in his father's tight, slanted print, "In case they try it again." "He told me when he knew he was sick," Reed said. "He said it was there if I needed it. He didn't tell me what to do with it. He trusted me to figure that out." Catherine was quiet. Then, "He sounds like he was a careful man." He was. Reed paused. "He also wasn't always. He made mistakes. He let some things go that he shouldn't have. But at the end he wanted to give me something that mattered." He paused. "That's enough." He heard her exhale slowly. "Send me your signature authority, and I'll have the revised acquisition documents drafted by end of week." "All right, and Mr. Calloway." A brief pause. "Thank you for coming back. Even after we threw you out. You didn't have to say that." "No, but it's true." She hung up. Reed sat on the creeper in the middle of the garage floor and looked at the truck he'd been working on and didn't move for a minute. Then Piper came in from the sun, backpack still on, homework in hand. She looked at him sitting on the floor. "Did something happen?" she asked. "Yeah." He stood up, put his hands in his pockets. "Good thing." "What kind of good thing?" "The deal's going through." He held out his hand. "The people who built the company are going to get paid what they're owed." Piper thought about this with the gravity she applied to most things. "Was that why you went to the big building? With all the glass? That was why." She reached up and took his hand. Her fingers were still slightly sticky from the orange she'd eaten outside. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. That lady who was mean to you. Are you still mad at her?" Reed thought about Catherine at the other end of the conference table, looking at the mail receipt, saying Dennis's name in that quiet voice, like she was just then understanding the shape of what had happened. "No," he said. "I don't think she's a bad person. I think she was moving fast and she didn't stop to look." Piper nodded slowly, like when you're on your bike and you don't look at the ground, and then you fall. Pretty much exactly like that. She swung his hand once. "Will she look next time?" Reed looked at the open bay door, at the afternoon sun on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, at the town beyond it going about its ordinary business. "I think so," he said. "Yeah, I think she will." The closing happened 26 days later. Reed signed the amended acquisition documents at Jean Fulton's office while Piper read a chapter book in the waiting room. Francis called at noon to confirm the wire transfers had cleared. Walt called at 2. He cried a little on the phone. Not much, just enough. The garage stayed the same. Reed went back to work the next morning. The truck he'd been under was done by lunch. He started on an alignment job in the afternoon. Piper on her fold-out table in the corner, working on a science project about weather systems. At some point he looked up from the alignment rack and she was watching him. "What?" He said nothing. Just. She looked back at her paper. "I think Grandpa would be happy." Reed set down his tool. He'd been thinking about that since the morning after the closing, when he'd found himself standing in the garage before the workday started, looking at the old framed photo he kept on the shelf above the tool chest. Dale Calloway at 26, standing outside his first garage with his arms crossed and a look on his face like he dared the world to tell him he couldn't. "Yeah, baby," Reed said. "I think he would be." Piper went back to her weather systems. Reed went back to the alignment job. The radio played something with steel guitar. Outside, the light went sideways through the open bay door, the way it did in the late afternoon. Golden and a little dusty, the kind of light that made ordinary things look like they meant something. It did mean something. He'd walked into a room where he didn't belong, with dirty hands and a kid and a folder full of papers, and he'd told the truth about what those papers said. And in the end, the truth had been enough. Not easy, not clean, but enough. That was the part he wanted Piper to understand when she was old enough to ask. Not that the good guys always won. Not that the system was fair. Just that showing up with the truth was still worth doing. That sometimes the people on the other side of the table were capable of hearing it if you said it plainly and didn't flinch. And that the best thing his father had ever given him wasn't the equity stake. It was the envelope with his name on it, and the trust that he'd figure out what to do.